And it says no tax filing for seniors above 75 with only pension and trust income. A dispute resolution committee for small taxpayers is being planned. Minimum taxable income of up to 50 lakh, disputed income of up to rupees 10 lakh eligible for to approach dispute resolution committee. Now, of course, I'll come to the difficulties which we are likely to have in its implementation with regard to the modalities and workability of this a little later. But let me first highlight some of the points which I want to say that according to me, I should discuss here. The other is the access to deposits, and it says the finance minister announced that in case a bank fails or withdrawals from the banks are stopped due to financial pressure on the bank, the depositors will be able to get immediate access to their deposits up to the deposit insurance amount of rupees 5 lakh. The another, as Mr. Tulsian also pointed out, the budget proposal setting up faceless dispute resolution committees for individual taxpayers, making income tax appellate tribunal faceless, and constituting the dispute resolution committee for small taxpayers. I think that's another important decision which has been taken. I'll come to its efficacy a little later. Then disinvestment target, I think that is another important point which has been discussed from the economy's point of view. And the government sees FY 2020 fiscal deficit at 6.8% according to the FM, while she had pegged the deficit at 3.5% for FY 21. In the last budget, government aims to get rupees 1.75 lakh crore through disinvestment, through divestment in 21-22. According to budget document, in FY 21, it planned to raise 2.1 crore through divestment, falling short CPSE in all, but 4 sectors will be eventually privatized. I think that's another important area which I would like to discuss with the distinguished participants here, and I would like to be enlightened with the views which the participants may be having here. Then monetizing land, that's another important aspect which is the government has come out, because I think this will again help to strengthen boost the government revenue. The budget 2021 gave a renewed push to disinvestment and assets monetization as the government strives for capital creation. Monetizing of land will be taken up. A SPV will be launched to carry out this activity, said the finance minister. Another important issue is with regard to the insurance sector, where the FM announced plan to privatize 2 public sector undertakings and 1 general insurance company in FY 22. The government will bring a long-awaited LIC IPO in financial year 22, adding that it planned to complete the divestment of BPCL and Concor and SCI in 2021. I think with this investment, probably the count of deficit which may be there, government may try to cover that deficit under this. Then another important aspect which has come in this budget is with regard to the codification of laws. And I think in the securities market, it becomes very important. And the FM has proposed to consolidate provisions of the SEBI Act, Depository Act, Securities Contract Regulation Act, and the Government Securities Act. Government aims to amend Insurance Act to allow higher FDI, increasing FDI limit in insurance to 74% from 49% and allowing foreign ownership. I think that's a very important decision which government is going to take. Maybe I was told, and I understand, I was reading in newspaper also, there was a time when this government was in opposition, probably they were the one who opposed this kind of proposal. And now, of course, they have come out with this suggestion. Maybe there is a change of thought, or maybe it all depends on which side of the table you are and you take the decision accordingly. Probably this may be a result of that, but okay, we can deliberate on this. Then another important point which come to my mind is the interest earned by the Provident Fund contributions about 2.5 lakh a year will now be taxed at the normal rate. I think people may not have liked it, may not be happy. Of course, at least I'm not happy on that. This will only apply to employees' contribution and not that of the employer, It will hit high income salaried people who use the voluntary provident fund to earn tax-free interest. This is the argument given for it. And then another important point which I want to highlight from the budget perspective is that there has been a greater thrust so far as the allocation to the MSME sector is concerned, and the finance minister has proposed doubling of the MSME allocation, setting aside 15,700 crore for the medium and small enterprises. I think this is a big boost being given to the MSME sector, and this will definitely help us in reviving the economy and maybe in generating a little bit of employment also. One more point which I would like to highlight with regard to the budget, and then I will come to the specifics where I have certain views with regard to the proposals which are contained in the budget, and is that so far as the infrastructure spending is concerned, the thrust of the government has been more particularly in the 4 states which we are going to have elections during this year or in the next year. Most of the amount is being spent there. Now, yesterday I was watching a TV program, and in that TV program, the senior minister, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, when he was asked about this particular question, that why there was a more thrust so far as these particular poll-bound states are concerned and not to the others. His answer was, I think he's one of those ministers who normally gives straightforward answer to some of the questions. And his answer to that was, well, don't forget we may be in the government, but at the end of the day, we are also a political party. So definitely we are making certain statements and we have to spend some money. And if we are highlighting certain states where we are going for elections, what is wrong in that? It's not that we are not spending money in infrastructure in other states. We're spending there also. But if we are highlighting 4 particular states, what is wrong in that? But the fact remains, there is a more spending in these states with a political motive. But I'm happy that at least one of the minister of this of the government is willing to admit that fact that whatever we have done, maybe there is a political backing to it, but the fact remains it is with a bona fide intention under which, but ultimately it is the state which will be benefited. So, and one more point which I would like to highlight is, and of course, all of you must be interested in this and all you already know it, what the finance minister said is that tax return filers during the last 4 to 5 years have almost doubled. I think that's a great satisfaction. There is a more compliance. Maybe more compliance is because of more monitoring on the part of the government, and at the same time because it is being used, technology is being used, and that can be the reason, because if there are more transactions online, obviously they come to the public domain, and therefore the number of tax filers from which was about 3.31 crore in 2014 has now come to 6 crore and 6.48 crore in 2020. And maybe I think in the year to come, because it will again increase the kind of convergence which has been done in the returns which you are filing on the tax, direct taxes or indirect taxes, and probably even with regard to GST also, when they are being converged, probably I think the number will still increase. Let us see how it works, because there are people, and generally, I mean, on the lighter side of it, it is said that lawbreakers are more intelligent than the lawmakers. This is generally said. So there will be people who may try to find out a way out to this particular aspect also. But I think the moment our systems get streamlined and are foolproof, probably this kind of loopholes can be checked and protected. Now, coming to the specific issues which Mr. Tulsian has also raised, and probably I also have some reservation on some of the issues. I would like to express my own views on some of this, like the kind of relief first I take, because I am also a senior citizen, and I would like to talk about the relief given to the senior citizen with regard to filing of a return. Of course, this is an important step taken, and I don't dispute that. Well, some people will be getting relief about it. But the question is, once you are taking a decision at the national level, you also have to see how many people are actually going to be benefited by this. Now, I have a question for all of you, and that question is, suppose I am a senior citizen, above 75 years of age, I am getting my pension and interest income also. Then probably it will be more easy to implement it if I have only one bank account, and in that bank account, I am getting my interest income also and my pension also. Suppose I have invested my money in 3 or 4 or 5 different banks, and I am getting interest income from there. How that calculation is going to be made? I think that position is not yet clarified. Maybe once the rules are made, that we get some clarity on that particular aspect. Probably this is one area which needs to be looked into, and probably we need more clarity when the rules are framed on this particular aspect. Then, talking of faceless assessment and faceless appeals, we cannot avoid it or we cannot resist it, because ultimately it is the technology which is going to rule us, and the use of technology in all our transactions is going to increase. The only question which I am putting here for your consideration is, are our systems so perfect and so user friendly that with faceless assessment and faceless appeal, you can get the kind of justice which you are expecting, or you can have the kind of interaction which you normally have in a physical interaction? If you can have, I think this is a very good step. But if you can't, probably then there are difficulties, and probably our generation will have to face that difficulty till the system can't get perfection. Now, my own take on this is, probably whatever systems have been created, they are not user friendly, they are service provider friendly. Now, take for example, I'm just giving you one example. A friend of mine who himself is a senior citizen, he got some assessment order and he wanted to file an appeal before the commissioner appeal. Now, he was told that you have to file it only online, and you will get order online only. He filed an appeal online. Now, for the last 9 months, he has been sending emails, but he is not getting any response to the emails. If he goes to the department and says that I'm not getting any response, what should I do? They say, you send an email, we can't tell you anything physically. That's the problem which he is facing. And on the other hand, what happens? If department want to send some communication, they will send you an email, and instead of giving you a proper notice, the email is sent on 30th evening at 6 o'clock, and they expect you to file a reply on 31st morning by 10 o'clock. And if you don't say file a reply, you get a letter saying that, say, you are not responded, I'm finalizing this assessment or I'm passing this order. So I think this kind of difficulty if you are facing, then probably this system is, as I said, that is the service provider oriented and not the consumer or the end user oriented. Probably we have to fix all these loopholes so that the systems become perfect. And if the systems become perfect, probably the kind of result which we want to achieve will be much better, more useful. Now, coming to the income tax appellate tribunal becoming faceless, I think that is, I have my own reservation as on today about this success, only because of the reason which I have said. More particularly, we have seen that this e-courts or virtual courts, I remember, I can share my own experience. And I was participating in a government function where the ministers were there, judges of the High Court and Supreme Court were there, senior advocates were there, and it was a government function where I was also participating as a law secretary, law minister was also there. This was way back in 2015, 16, if I correctly remember. And one of the ministers said, how to reduce the pendency in the courts? And spontaneously, my response at that time was, why don't you start like live proceedings of the courts, telecast of the live proceeding of the court, as you are doing in case of parliament? Some of the senior advocates as well as judges, they immediately said, this is not possible, this can't happen. This was the thinking in 2016-15. Although the process of computerization, use of information technology in the courts processes started way back in early 90s, but till 2015-16, this was the thought process. But the moment COVID came and everything was shut down, everybody was forced to use this system. And fortunately, of course, this technology has created a digital divide, no doubt about it. But I think this is a short-term measure which we will overcome little later. But the fact remains, now courts have been forced, tribunals have been forced, councils have been forced, judges have been forced to use the technology and to deliver justice. And this is what is happening. And I think in the times to come, it will happen. But as in today, probably that stage is not reached because we don't have a dedicated platform for that or a safe platform for that. There are security risks available. There are issues with regard to data protection. The technology is not perfect. People living in remote area, probably the connectivity is still a problem for them. Unless we are able to do that, or unless we are able to create an infrastructure at the taluka level, at the district level, where without glitches, the technology can function, probably faceless justice delivery will not be able to be achieved, or it will remain a myth. Maybe those who are technologically well, they can use it. People like Mr. Tulsian may be sitting in Calcutta by using technology. Today, he may be in an advantageous position that sitting in his office, he can attend a hearing in Supreme Court, he can attend a hearing on the same date in Madras High Court, he can attend the hearing on the same date in Calcutta High Court, but the others can't do it. So the point which I'm making here is, the steps which have been taken, they are in the right direction. But are we moving too fast in this particular direction? Have we really dealt with the glitches which we are going to face to see that the ultimate aim of delivering justice to the man at his doorstep and is achieved? I think this is a question to be pondered upon. So there is a need that government should come out with the data protection law. Our system should be fully secure, and we should have dedicated platform from where this justice delivery system can be executed, fully executed. Only then the faceless assessment and faceless this appeals will be possible. Again, with a caveat, I'm saying it may not be possible in all cases. As I'm saying, in case of courts also, it has to be a hybrid model, because there may be cases where personal interaction or personal explanation becomes necessary. Because what is happening in the virtual courts as on today also? You simply file documents. How much weightage is given to those documents? And suppose the person who is presiding that particular bench, he is not that sincere, and if in delivering the justice, quite possible he may not fully apply his mind, and he make use of the research associated with him, and ultimately get an order dictated and then loads it on the website. And the person who is filing an appeal, he may not get full justice because all his arguments are not taken care of. So I think these are the kind of honesty which is needed on the part of the litigant, the kind of honesty which is needed on the part of the practitioner, the kind of honesty which is needed on the part of the bench. Unless that honesty comes and probably the system becomes flawless, the implementation of this particular system will be little difficult. Now, coming to this particular point of rebate that the senior citizens who are 75 and above need not file a return, I have already said probably there is a difficulty in its implementation. The other point is with regard to if your total deposits under the Provident Fund are more than 2.5 lakh, then the income, the interest earned of that will become taxable. Now, on the one hand, the government is going for a bigger picture for the nation, and you are looking for infrastructure development and larger policy decisions which will be implemented in the years to come for the economic growth. And on the other hand, you are going for this kind of small amendments where your revenue contribution or revenue effect will not be that much. I don't know how much revenue government is going to earn. And today only I was reading in the newspaper And the junior minister, Mr. Anurag Singh Thakur, who was, I mean, of course, associated with this budget, he was put a question and he was asked, several individuals are unhappy with the steps on PF and ULIP taxation. And his answer is, the scheme, that is PF, is for workers who are paid 8% tax-free. If someone invests rupees 2 crore, is it fair to provide annual tax-free interest income of rupees 15 to 60 lakh to them? People contributing up to rupees 2.5 lakh do not have to pay tax. Less than 1% will be affected. If you yourself know only less than 1% will be affected, in a budget which जिसके आप कहते हैं ना दूरदृष्टि, अगर ये दूरदृष्टि वाला बजट है, then why you are making a provision which is not going to affect even 1% of the provident fund people? And secondly, this figure itself of saying that a person is depositing 2 crore or 3 crore provident, it is just impossible. It can't be done. Because in the PPF, you can deposit maximum of 1.5 lakh. And in PF, because it is related to your salary, the maximum amount which you can deposit in PF cannot exceed your salary amount. So I don't think anybody will be depositing, and the effect itself is so. So where was the need to bring this kind of amendment? Because we ultimately, even in taxation laws also, when we're talking about the laws generally, I think the laws should have some stability and it should be for a long term. I'm happy that no changes have been brought in the taxation structure in this particular year. And I am happy, and I personally feel that once a tax structure is given, it should be valid for a period of 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, so that people can plan their future taxation accordingly, which is not happening. Every year bringing amendments, we all of us know what was the shape of the Income Tax Act in 1961 and what shape it has today. And I generally say, I have said it in the past also, and I'm repeating it. If you look at the Income Tax Act, it is not an Income Tax Act. It is an act dealing with rebates and deductions on tax. Because most of the provisions, they deal with rebate and deduction, not with the imposition of tax. So I think if you really want a kind of stability, then probably this kind of amendments are not needed if it is not going to largely affect the revenue of the government. Now, coming back to the disinvestment policy of the government, I'm happy that government is thinking of disinvestment. It has been done in the past also. But the past also, the government has not succeeded to the extent the government wanted to do the disinvestment. And even if you have to do the disinvestment, I can understand if you are disinvesting Air India, where you see that government's involvement is not necessary. And then it is a loss-making concern. If you can't run it, give to a person who can run it better. Now, yes, you want to say something, Tulsianji? No. Okay. So now talking of disinvestment in LIC, bringing at an IPO and involving public at large, or the for FDI in the insurance sector. I think there will be two definitely divided views on this. One view is whatever sector you have opened up, we have seen that those sectors have grown. To that extent, it is good. But then there are certain areas where really you need to give protection for the better life of the citizens itself. I'm at least conscious of the fact that even today also, in spite of the fact that the working of the LIC might not have improved to the extent the private sector insurance companies have done, but the fact remains, even today, LIC is the best administered insurance company in the country, and people can depend and safely invest in the LIC. Which is not true about other, that kind of confidence has not been generated by other insurance company, the confidence which people have today in LIC. I don't know what is going to be the future of this particular aspect. I think that needs to be deliberated. Maybe government has taken a decision, it may be well thought of, after a long time it is coming. Disinvestment, nothing wrong in that. But then there is another saying also, do you really sell your silverware to run your day-to-day expenses? This is the oft-quoted example. So are we doing that? If we are doing that, probably there is a question mark to it. But if you are not selling your silverware, you are only selling the discarded material, which probably you feel, probably you don't want to use, somebody else can use it in a better way. To that extent, I think there is nothing wrong in the decision. Now, coming to the securities market and the consolidation of the laws relating to the securities market, I'm happy with the decision of the government that government has thought of consolidating the laws dealing with the securities market. Similar kind of exercise has been done, even with regard to the labor laws also, where the government is converting about 55 labor legislations into 4 codes. Of course, I think it will take a little more time because it is still a work in progress. But in the securities market also, if there are large number of legislation, obviously it creates a problem in the mind of the individual. And it is strictly in accordance with the policies of the government to reduce the number of laws so that the end user, the person on the ground, the common man, the citizen for whom you are making the laws, he is in a better position to understand it in a better way, and probably the compliance will become much better. Now, let me see what are the other points which I had in mind. One very important point which is coming to my mind with regard to the finance bill, and which of course I have debated earlier also, and this practice has started with the government for the last about 4 or 5 years. And that practice is any law which is even indirectly or remotely connected to something which government want to carry out, put it as an annexure to the finance bill and get it cleared from the Lok Sabha as a money bill. Now, it started with the Aadhaar Act. Aadhaar Act was passed as a money bill by the Lok Sabha. Its validity was also challenged. Similarly, in 2017, all of you must be remembering that there was an annexure to the Finance Act, whereby the terms and condition of appointment of members and presiding officer of almost all the tribunals of the country, there are about 17 or 18 enactments which were amended by putting a schedule, and all these acts were amended by the Finance Act. Maybe one of the reasons that might be at the back of the mind of the government at that time might have been that probably getting this kind of amendments passed from the Rajya Sabha because of the numbers will not be possible, and therefore get it through as a finance bill. And that happened. The validity of it was challenged. Of course, the Supreme Court has already upheld the validity, saying that because under the law, under Article 109, 1010, whether a bill is a finance money bill or not, the decision on this will be that of the Speaker is final. But that finality is subject to judicial review or not? That's the important question. Of course, by majority, the Supreme Court has already said, well, we will not go into it. But Justice Chandrachud, in his minority opinion, has given certain reasons which really call for deliberation for the academician and for the law student and for the law practitioners. That is it a good practice? The parliamentary practices which are well established from 1950 onward, and the procedures which have been prescribed, if we are simply bypassing them for the simple objective of getting the bill passed quickly, is it a healthy practice? I think it puts a big question mark on it. Therefore, whatever amendments have been proposed in the LIC Act, in the Life Insurance Act, by putting it in the schedule in the finance bill, I think that's is it a good practice? I think that needs to be debated. Although, as I said, if the speaker says it is part of the finance bill, and I mean, there is no question mark on that. Court will not intervene because of the judgment, but a review petition was filed, which is again, I think, my understanding, it is still pending. It has not yet been disposed of. It is not yet, it is still pending before the Supreme Court. But the reasoning given by Mr. Chandrachud as that even the decision taken by the speaker with regard to a particular being a money bill is subject to judicial review, I think that's the correct legal position, and maybe sometime in future it will be reviewed by the Supreme Court itself. Not today, maybe sometime it will be done. And as you know, law is always evolving, and probably I know we have a vibrant judiciary, and whenever there have been a difficulty, the judiciary has risen to the occasion. And maybe the time will come when judiciary will rise to the occasion. And this kind of amendments, probably some sense of discipline will be brought, and the kind of practice which has started, that whatever law you want to amend, declare it as a money bill, put it as an annexure to the Finance Act. Probably this practice which has started a few years back need to be reviewed so that there is a proper scrutiny of all these bills by both houses of the parliament and not only by the Lok Sabha. So I think by and large, the policies decision taken by the government and the kind of consideration which has been given to the education sector, health sector, without bringing much changes into the Income Tax Act, is a well thought of decision taken by the government. And as I said earlier also, probably this is a budget for the future and not for our immediate needs. But some of the aspects which I've highlighted, I think they needs consideration or rather reconsideration. How it will be done, whether it will be done or not, maybe as I said, there have been in the past also instances where government has reviewed its own earlier decision whenever there has been a demand from the public and reasons are given for it. And if we come out with some good reasons for this, more particularly with regard to the small changes which have been made even with regard to taxation, and probably if we feel they are not required, probably government is open and will be willing to reconsider it. This is my wishful thinking. So I think I can say many other things, but then I know there is a time constraint also. And most of the things I wanted to discuss with you with regard to the bill, I have tried to cover in my talk. Maybe because you are all people who have been in the profession for so long, rather much more than what I have spent either in the government or in the profession. Maybe you have certain issues which you would like to share your thoughts with me so that I also become a better and an enlightened citizen on those particular aspects. With these words, I again thank Income Tax Bar Association, Calcutta, for affording me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this a very important topic. Of course, debates have been going on many platforms. Of course, I was busy in some other assignments, so therefore couldn't hear many of the debates. But any of you who has participated and have another view on the points which I have expressed, I'll be very happy to hear your views also on that. Thank you, Mr. Tulsian. Thank you, Income Tax Bar Association. Thank you very much.
Sir, we are grateful to you, sir, for giving a wonderful overview of the union budget. You have been very forthright and frank in appreciating as well as depreciating the provisions of the finance bill, wherein your views has come out very clearly what is good for the country, what is not good for the country, and what is good precedent and what is not good precedent. We are really enlightened to hear these voices from you, and our members will be hugely benefited with the talk which you have given us today. But I would request you to continue to be there, because Ajay Bora, your most beloved colleague, is there, who will be
Yes.
taking us through the direct tax provisions. You know, he's not only a senior advocate, but he's one of the most enlightened advocate in the country today, who can really take us through the very important amendments which has been brought in this finance bill in the direct tax provisions. Now I will call upon Sri Ajay Bora to please take the stage, and I would request our secretary, Sri Himadri Mukhopadhyay, to please give a brief introduction of Sri Ajay Bora.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is really my pleasure and my honor to welcome Mr. Ajay Bora, Senior Advocate. Mr. Ajay Bora is a Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Law and fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. His practicing area is the domestic and international taxation, including litigation, advisory, corporate reorganization, and tax planning and transfer pricing. Mr. Bora, a qualified chartered accountant and lawyer, and has been practicing since last 36 years in the area of domestic and international tax, and is leading arguing counsel before the tax tribunals, high courts, and the Supreme Court. He has argued several cases involving complex issues having wide ramifications, which has contributed immensely to the tax jurisprudence in the country. Prior to being designated as senior advocate by the Delhi High Court in September 2014, Mr. Vora was managing partner of Vaish Associates Advocates, a leading law firm from 2006 to 2014. Mr. Vora has been rated as one of the most highly acclaimed legal experts in the Asia Pacific region in the field of taxation by Asia Law Leading Lawyers Guide for each of the years from 2006 to 2014. Prior to this designation as senior advocate, the Legal 500 has inducted him into the Hall of Fame for Asia Pacific for having been recommended as a leading individual within tax for 13 consecutive years. Other pursuits of Mr. Vora, he has been regularly contributing articles in various journals and addressing seminars nationally and internationally. He has been the past chairman of the International Fiscal Association, India branch, past chairman of the Direct Taxes Committee of the PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as also member of the Managing Committee uninterruptedly for several years, vice chair of the Tax Law Committee of the International Pacific Bar Association. Mr. Vora has also served on the board of several large corporates. Now may I request Mr. Ajay Vora to deliver his lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tulsian, for extending this invitation to me. Mr. P.K. Malhotra, former Secretary Law and a former member of the tribunal with whom I share a good rapport and before whom I had the privilege of appearing while he was adorning the benches in Delhi, and friends at the Income Tax Bar Association, Calcutta. This presentation of the finance bill is an annual exercise, and the discussions that follow thereafter are again a ritual that is gone into by the tax practicing fraternity and community across the country. As Mr. Malhotra said in his opening remarks, he gave a substantial overview of the economic aspects of the budget, issues relating to taxation, and he also dwelt on the increasing use of technology. Now, thanks to this increasing use of technology, I am here and he's here. We are both in Delhi, but we are addressing the ITBA in Calcutta. And thanks to technology and Mr. Tulsian's invitation, it has been made possible. Speaking for myself, I was in Delhi before the Supreme Court, before the High Court, before the Tribunal, before the Karnataka High Court, and now I have traveled to Calcutta all in one day. Thanks to the increasing use of technology which has made it available. But I think this is the subject of a substantial debate, and as Mr. Malhotra alluded to, the divide. In fact, lawyers are today divided on whether we should continue with this virtual mode of hearings before different courts, and what about those who do not have access to technology or infrastructure, do not have access to connectivity, whether those people should be deprived of the chance and the opportunity to practice before different courts. But I'll come to that when I deal with this question of today the faceless ITAT, which is one of the major changes suggested by this budget. So the way I seek to proceed is break this discussion into three parts within the time that is allotted to me. One is deal with major substantive amendments that have been made. Then I will come to changes in relating to assessment and the appeal procedure, and some miscellaneous issues that I seek to touch upon. Now, getting straight into the subject, I think the first issue that I seek to raise is this amendment with respect to employee contribution to PF. And I'll pick on what Mr. Malhotra said. Do we need to pick out these really small, insignificant amendments and make it as a part of the finance bill? Any delay in payment of employee contribution to PF is already penalized under the respective statute. We are now seeking to penalize the employer by saying that even a day's delay in making the employee's contribution to the relevant authority would deny the employer for deduction for all times to come. Now, curiously, the courts have decided this issue in favor. They made no distinction between the employer's contribution, which is covered under 43B, and the employee's contribution, which is subject of section 36(1)(5)(a). And the Central Board of Direct Taxes recently decided to accept those decisions of the various courts to put an end to the litigation. This is a complete turnaround. This is a complete volte-face to now say that we are once again restoring this amendment in the law to say that a day's delay in deposit of employee's contribution to Provident Fund would result in denial of deduction to the employer. So I leave it to that, but I think this is something which is insignificant, should not really have been touched upon, having regard to the fact that the law was just settling down after the CBDT decided to accept the court decisions. Then there is a change in the definition of slum sale in section 242C, and this is again prompted by some court decisions. If you recall, the Bombay High Court in the case of Bharat Bijli had taken the view that if there is a sale and in consideration of the sale, you are allotted shares instead of money consideration, then that would amount to an exchange and not in the nature of a slum sale. The provisions of section 50B, which deal with computation of capital gains on a slum sale, would not be attractive. Now, in order to nullify those judgments, and those judgments were thereafter adopted and followed by several courts and benches of the tribunal. To nullify those judgments, now we are seeking to make an amendment to section 242C to expand the definition of slum sale to mean transfer by any means, including exchange. So therefore, going forward, I think this will not be available anymore to the assessees. But I think the fortunate part is this is not made retrospectively applicable. So with respect to transactions going forward, this will become the law and this will be subjected to tax. An innocuous amendment, which probably didn't find mention either in the finance minister's speech or has not been deliberated much, is this definition of the term liable to tax. In section 2, we are proposing to add subsection 29A to define the word liable to tax to mean that there is a liability of tax on that person under the law of any country, and will include a case where subsequent to imposition of such tax liability an exemption has been provided. Now, if the person is not liable to tax in the country of his residence, that means, let us say example of UAE, where there is no personal income tax. Now that man is, as per this definition, not liable to tax in the UAE. And if he crosses the threshold of more than 15 lakhs of income in India, then in that situation, he becomes a deemed resident of India in terms of section 6(1) capital A, and therefore his foreign source income may become taxable in India. I think this is an amendment of far-reaching ramifications. Unfortunately, not touted about much, not debated on much, but it will hit people who are outside the country and who enjoy and earn income in India in excess of 15 lakhs per annum, which is hardly anything. Now, if people have a house property, people have income from interest and so on. Now, those people need to be on the guard to ensure that they don't fall into this trap of the definition of liable to tax in India. Then, with respect to charitable trusts and institutions, the amendment that is proposed in section 1023C with respect to the annual revenues of educational institutions or hospitals, and that's a welcome amendment. That limit is sought to be increased from 1 crore to 5 crores. So therefore, those institutions and charitable organizations will not be liable to tax anymore, and they don't have to comply with the regulations provided under section 1023C in order to enjoy a tax-free status, a tax-exempt status. The other change that is made with respect to charitable institutions is again seeking to negate some of the court decisions, and including which has been settled up to the Supreme Court, that if there is a deficit in 1 year, you could offset the deficit against the income of a subsequent year. So assuming you have deficit in a couple of years, and going forward, you earn income which is in excess of the 15%, you could claim that you had applied the income in the past in excess of the income earned in those years, and that deficit should have been set off against the current year's revenue. Now, this is sought to be set at naught by making this amendment in section 1023C as also in section 11. So going forward, I think one will have to look at basically the spending or the application of income in the relevant year itself, without taking into account the amount that was available as deficit in the past. We now have this much debated and according to the department, much misused claim of depreciation on goodwill arising pursuant to corporate reorganization. The Supreme Court in the case of Smith Securities for the first time held that in the case of amalgamation of companies where the consideration paid is more than the assets of the amalgamating company that vest in the amalgamated company pursuant to the amalgamation, the difference may be regarded as goodwill on which depreciation is admissible. Now, the courts thereafter in several judgments amplified the scope of goodwill to include various intangible rights or business or commercial rights such as trademark licenses, quotas, tenancy rights, employee human capital, and so on and so forth, and held that these are in the nature of business or commercial rights on which depreciation is admissible in the category of intangible assets. And in that category was also included goodwill of the business. So goodwill was treated as a depreciable asset, and on that basis, the claim was being allowed by various benches of the tribunal. The department has in several cases sought to pick holes into the view taken by the tribunal and the high courts by either bringing in the amendment to section 32 in terms of the fifth proviso, by bringing in section 170 and so on and so forth. But all those challenges have been negated by reasoned orders by the tribunal, which upheld the allowance of depreciation on goodwill arising pursuant to corporate reorganization, and in a situation where there was actually consideration paid for acquisition of the goodwill. So if you take a case where, for instance, consideration is discharged to the shareholders of the amalgamating company by way of issue of shares of the amalgamated company, and the net value of assets acquired of the amalgamating company is lower than the consideration, that difference was treated as goodwill amenable to the claim of depreciation. Similarly, in a situation where, let us say, in one of the decided cases, where the shares held by the amalgamated company in the amalgamating company cancel out as a result of the amalgamating company merging with the amalgamated company. In that situation, the benches of the tribunal took the view that the amount of investment made in the amalgamating company is really the sum total of the amount paid for acquisition of various intangible assets and intangible rights, which was amenable to depreciation. So this decision seeks to negate the allowance of depreciation on goodwill. But I think this one amendment will propagate substantial litigation. Litigation in the form of the question whether what is barred is only depreciation on goodwill, or does it take away depreciation on various intangible assets, which may be described in the balance sheet as compendiously described in the balance sheet as goodwill. So whether the bar can be read widely to exclude all kinds of intangible assets, rights that are acquired by virtue of the corporate reorganization. That's one question. The second is, does it apply to goodwill acquired post 1st April 2020? And mind you, this amendment is made applicable for the current financial year. Normally, provisions in the finance bill take effect from 1/4/22, that is assessment year 22-23. This is made applicable from 1/4/20. I would take the view that it should apply to goodwill acquired after 1/4/20 and not to goodwill acquired any period prior thereto. The further question that will arise is whether goodwill would be available with respect to, depreciation would be available with respect to goodwill acquired in the past and which forms part of a block of assets. Now, there is a consequential amendment proposed in the definition of block of assets in section 2, subsection 11, to say that it will not include goodwill of a business or profession. So does it mean that goodwill which is already embedded in a block of assets in the earlier years would now be removed? If it needs to be removed, there is no mechanism provided how you need to isolate the value of goodwill, because the block is one, the block is inextricably mixed, and you cannot possibly find out, the extent of the value of goodwill embedded in the block. What is the written down value of goodwill on a standalone basis that forms part of the block of assets? Now, these questions are going forward likely to arise, and this, in my view, will be the basis for future litigation on this subject, because corporate litigation, corporate reorganization today is happening on a large scale, especially post the pandemic. Many companies are seeking to reorganization. There are buyouts, there are consolidation of businesses, and so on and so forth. And this is, I think, a commercial reality. This is a fait accompli in these kind of corporate reorganizations, corporate structuring. And it is not that it is done for any tax purposes. So this is one situation where the amendment has been made retrospective in that sense by making it applicable from 1/4/2020. Then this is a welcome change with respect to the increase in the safe harbor limit for developers who develop land and building and are seeking to sell the same to consumers, customers, and so on. Now, the safe harbor is sought to be increased to 20% instead of the existing 10% of the stamp duty valuation. So if there is a difference between the consideration paid and the stamp duty valuation, which is within this range of 20%, then in that situation, no adverse view will be taken, provided the other conditions laid down in the section are met, which is that the transfer of the residential unit takes place from 12th November 2020 to 30th June 21. Transfer is by way of first time allotment of the residential unit to any person, and the consideration received or accruing does not exceed rupees 2 crores. I think if you want to kickstart the economy, if you want to give a fillip to the real estate sector, all these conditions are really not necessary once we know that the stamp duty valuation is really hypothetical, it is artificial, it does not take into account the ground realities and the prices prevailing in the markets, having regard to the depressed state of the real estate market. So I would think that the government has done well, but it has stopped short in order to incentivize the real estate sector to really be able to dispose of the large unsold inventory lying with several developers. Then another major change is under section 45(4), which provides that in the case of dissolution of a firm or otherwise, where there is transfer of capital assets, in that situation, the fair market value of the assets is taken into account for computing capital gains. Now, one is aware of the fact that you have again decided precedents that where before the date of retirement or dissolution, the value of self-generated assets or acquired assets was written up and was revalued, and the amount credited to the capital account of the partners. Subsequently, one or more of the partners retired or withdrew from the firm and took the money standing to the credit of their capital account. The courts had taken a view that there is no tax incidence in such a situation. The bill proposes to plug this loophole by providing that if the firm seeks to revalue or enhance the value of self-generated assets or goodwill, then in that situation, it will no longer be tax exempt. And in that situation, section 45(4) is sought to be amended. And also a new section 45A is sought to be inserted in the statute to bring to tax this differential. So this amendment will take care of, the loophole in the law, which till now was accepted by the courts, and the courts had taken a view that in such kind of situation, there would actually be no tax incidence on the partner withdrawing monies in excess of the equivalent to the money standing to the credit of his capital account, nor should the firm be subjected to any tax thereon. Mr. Malhotra has been in the law ministry, he's headed the ministry for very long years. My lament all along has been that people in the tax net are the people who tend to bear the brunt of taxation and the increasing amount of taxes. Unfortunately, the tax net has not widened, and the burden of taxes falls on those who voluntarily submit their tax returns. Now, the government is trying hard to identify new taxpayers. It is increasing the width and breadth of provisions relating to deduction of tax at source so as to identify and bring into the tax net new taxpayers or potential taxpayers. Now, one such attempt is now a new section 194Q to make the buyer liable to deduct tax at 0.1%, where the buyers acquires goods from a seller in excess of 50 lakhs, provided the conditions imposed in that section are satisfied, that the buyer has turnover of more than 10 crores and so on and so forth. But this is, I think, an attempt in the right direction. We would be getting substantial data from the field, which needs to be mined in order that we can identify potential taxpayers, make them voluntarily comply with the tax regulations, make them file their returns, and contribute to the exchequer. As was said by the late Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee, this is the taxes are the price for civilization. And I think people need to buy into that theory, that it is necessary for everyone to pay their legitimate and fair share of taxes in order that the country can progress. Similarly, this provision of TDS, TCS on non-filers at twice the rates of tax of 5%, whichever is higher. Again, I would welcome such a step. Why should people not voluntarily comply with the law if that's the law applicable across the board? And there should be a deterrent in the system for people who are seeking to evade their obligations, to avoid their obligations. India has taken the lead so far as implementation of the G20 recommendations are concerned. We brought in the equalization levy in 2016, and I spoke at length at one of the seminars organized by the ITBA. They brought in the equalization levy. 2018, there was amendment in the definition of business connection, which of course is presently not operative. Then Finance Act 2020 made far-reaching changes by seeking to introduce a new equalization levy with respect to online sale of goods or services. Now, issues had been raised in the past as to whether an online sale of goods or services can be said to be consummated when the delivery of goods happens offline, especially in the case of tangible goods. If you place an order on Amazon and the goods are ultimately delivered to you by a courier agency. Now, in that situation, can you say there is a sale of goods in terms of the Sale of Goods Act on the online platform? One had taken a view, and based on legal opinion, that the sale does not get consummated or concluded on the platform. So the platform is only a medium for the two parties, the seller and the buyer, to interact. But the sale is consummated, the sale is concluded with the delivery of ascertained goods, which happens offline. And therefore, this would not be a sale which would be treated as concluded on an online platform, exposing the online platform owner to this equalization levy. Now, this has been sought to be amended by making provision in the Finance Act of 2016 and clarifying that if there is even one of the activities that happens online, then in that situation, it will result in an online sale of goods or services, and thereby exposing the online operator of the platform to the equalization levy, and one of the activities could be acceptance of offer for sale, placing the purchase order, acceptance of the purchase order, payment of consideration, supply of goods or provision of services partly or wholly. So this is to take effect again from 1/4/2020, from the day the Finance Act 2020 made this amendment in the Finance Act of 2016 by bringing in equalization levy. We are all aware that the US has raised a dispute with India with regard to this equalization levy by holding it to be discriminatory. India has submitted its response to the US authorities contesting their position. The US also raised it with France, raised it with UK. Several of those countries have buckled under the US pressure, but India has stood up. India is defending its imposition in the form of this equalization levy. And from statistics that one reads in the papers, many of the US internet giants have started paying the equalization levy in India. So I think this is here to stay. And this will be a source of revenue for the Indian government with respect to e-commerce transactions. With respect to, again, the equalization levy, a question was raised in the past. I think that was due to some hasty drafting of the Finance Bill 2020, which was tabled maybe around 20th March 2020 and had to be passed before the pandemic set in. And there was little clarity on if a transaction is already liable to tax in India, whether it can be again subjected to equalization levy, especially with respect to royalties and fees for technical services. So the Finance Bill 2021 now seeks to clarify that where the transaction is otherwise liable to tax in India under the provisions of the Act or the double tax treaty, it will be taxed under the Act and not be subjected to the equalization levy. Again, this is to take effect retrospectively from 1st April 2020. So these are some of the substantive amendments made with regard to the various provisions of the Act. There are large-scale changes now proposed in the assessment of the appeal procedure, which are of far-reaching implications. I think a common thread, before I touch upon the individual and specific amendments, a common thread that seems to run through these amendments is to somehow neutralize and nullify independent judicial bodies which are constituted under the Income Tax Act, be it the Authority for Advance Ruling, be it the Income Tax Settlement Commission, be it the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. Now, the point that I'm seeking to make is by now seeking to replace the Income Tax Settlement Commission, and there is a drop dead date of 1st of February 2021, the date the Finance Bill was presented. By seeking to replace the Income Tax Settlement Commission by an interim board, by seeking to replace the Authority for Advance Ruling by a revenue body, which will be called the Board for Advance Rulings, staffed by income tax commissioners, is not sending the right message to the litigating public, and especially in case of the Authority for Advance Ruling, to the foreign taxpayers. So one really is unable to fathom for making these kind of wholesale changes in the structure of our institutions constituted under the Income Tax Act for dispensation of justice. So here, coming first to the Income Tax Settlement Commission, it was a body, and if you look at the history of the Income Tax Settlement Commission, it was set up on the recommendation of Justice Vanchu on the Vanchu Committee recommendations, and the history has been analyzed beautifully in a judgment of the Delhi High Court in the case of Vatika Township. So it provides a one-time opportunity, a lifetime opportunity to a tax evader to come clean, to make a clean breast make a full and true disclosure of his income, and settle the income once and for all. The Settlement Commission was doing a good job. In fact, one thought that you could settle your disputes for several years in a time-bound manner. The Settlement Commission had to pronounce orders within 18 months of the filing of the application. And you could cut short tedious, long-winded litigation with respect to complex cases where substantial revenue was bound to be locked. Now, in this process, the government received substantial tax amounts upfront when the tax evader or the applicant sought to avail the benefit or the remedy of approaching the Income Tax Settlement Commission. One cannot possibly see any reason for making the commission inoperative from the date the finance bill was presented in the Lok Sabha, and the Settlement Commission is today stopped from passing any orders with respect to pending applications, which will shift to this board, that the interim board that will be constituted in the meanwhile. There will be substantial questions that will arise with regard to the validity of such an assessment. What would happen to the past cases? What would happen to cases of assessees who come forward and make a full and true disclosure in confidence before the Settlement Commission? These are open questions. They were addressed on an earlier occasion when the government sought to make an amendment in the law to say that those settlement applications which were not disposed of before 31st March 2008 would automatically await. And fortunately, the court came to the rescue, and the courts unanimously held that such a provision was unwarranted. That was a breach with respect to the trust of the taxpayers on approaching the Settlement Commission and making a full and true disclosure. So one will really await to see what happens in this scenario. In place of the Settlement Commission, as I mentioned, the pending disputes will go there. There is now a proposal to constitute a new dispute resolution committee, I think, which is a poor substitute for the Settlement Commission, because this dispute resolution committee has limited role and has kept strict criteria for small and medium taxpayers to come to that dispute resolution committee. So here basically, again, it will be constituted, I would assume, by revenue officials, and one can approach that committee only in a situation where the returned income is 50 lakh rupees or less, and the aggregate amount of variation proposed in specified order is 10 lakh rupees or less. And such cases are outside the ambit of this dispute resolution committee. So while we are talking of mediation, while we are talking of arbitration to settle tax disputes, here was a mechanism in the form of the Income Tax Settlement Commission, which probably has lasted close to 40-45 years, and has dealt with substantial cases in the past, which has been taken away by this one amendment without any plausible explanation for such an action. The second is this advance ruling authority, set up again with a laudable objective of providing certainty to foreign taxpayers with respect to their transactions in India, or even with respect to a proposed transaction. And I remember, the first few cases before Justice Ranganathan, after his lordship retired from the Supreme Court, the Advance Ruling Authority did substantial work in this direction and encouraged foreign taxpayers to come forward, make a reference to the authority for advance ruling, and obtain a ruling and certainty with respect to interpretation of laws so far as the operations in India was concerned. For the last couple of years, the authority has not been able to attract the right kind of persons to either staff the committee, staff the authority, or to head the authority, which is the requirement was a retired judge of the Supreme Court, or a retired Chief Justice of a High Court, or a judge of the High Court who had been a judge for more than 7 years. Now, in that situation, merely because you do not find the right people and to substitute the authority for advance ruling with the board for advance ruling, where again you will have commissioners from the department manning that authority, will undermine the public confidence. I don't think there will be many applications now flowing to this board for advance ruling to pronounce on interpretation of double tax treaties or interpretation of Indian tax laws with respect to tax liability of a foreign company or a foreign entity doing business in India. Then I come to this um, a faceless ITAT. I think Mr. Malhotra extolled on the virtues of technology and how there has to be increasing use of technology in the days to come, and courts, lawyers, all need to be educated and all need to be trained in the use of technology so far as appearance before courts are concerned. I don't think for a moment one is disputing the use of technology for virtual hearing or for video conferencing. The question that is arising is that can you have a faceless ITAT where you are not even sure of your matter, and any caveated by saying you should have an honest taxpayer, a diligent taxpayer, a diligent bench, um, and technology should keep up and measure to the requirement of the hour. But the proposition is that if you are looking at a faceless tribunal, you are essentially saying, like a faceless assessment or a faceless appeal, you are essentially saying that you receive a notice of a pending appeal, you file written submissions, both sides file written submissions, and the judges would in the chamber read the written submission of both the parties and decide the matter. Now, we are all practitioners practicing before the tribunal for several years, that matters today are extremely complex. Sitting in the chambers and reading the written submissions, one may not be able to grasp the entire width and breadth of the dispute in question. It may be my failing that I do not address the issue in the right perspective. I do not bring out the complete facts that are required for a judicial disposal of the appeal. And the written submission may be wanting for several reasons. This will be putting a much greater onus and burden on the members of the tribunal to a go through the pleadings of both the parties, go through the documents on record, do their own research if necessary, and then come to a judicial determination of the issues in dispute. While we all welcome this virtual hearing mode, it may be here to stay, going by the fact that courts today are not very inclined to physical hearing, and there is this debate between different bodies, professional bodies, as to whether physical hearing should resume or we continue with the virtual mode, or there should be a hybrid position. We'll leave that apart for the time being. But what is intended is a regime where the parties don't appear at all, either through a virtual mode or through a physical appearance, and that the tribunal members, on the basis of the pleadings on record, would decide the matter. I think that will be, according to me, a tall order. That would be violative of principles of natural justice. Although one is aware of the fact that some courts have taken a view that opportunity of being heard cannot be equated to a personal hearing. But the fact of the matter is that as we see in our daily life, in our everyday practice, there are issues that require to be debated. There are different points of view when you are arguing the matter physically. The court puts questions to you. You have to respond to what is falling from the bench. You have to maybe change gears while standing on your feet. And therefore, all this would not be possible if it becomes a faceless ITAT. One is not forum shopping. One is not looking at that my matter should be decided by a particular bench. That's not the intent. But the fact is, you will still nevertheless require an opportunity of personal hearing to present your point of view, to be able to counter what is projected by the other side, and therefore that will be equivalent to a fair, according to me, a fair opportunity of being heard, where both sides are adequately heard and the matter is appreciated in its depth and its perspective. And we all know that today matters require substantial paper books in terms of facts, paper books in terms of law. All that, uh, if it is submitted to the tribunal and to expect the tribunal to have gone through all the documents on record, I think would be a great expectation. And I would think that as stakeholders in this appeal disposal process, um, we would all need to ensure that the tribunal is able to do justice by making available, as officers of the court, the relevant facts of the case, the applicable law, whether for and against the appellant, and assist the bench to reach a judicial determination of the matter. So, my view is that this probably is not a well thought out measure to have a faceless ITAT. And I ask myself the question that we are talking of a faceless ITAT when there are so many other tribunals in the country. This tribunal has been the mother tribunal, as is often said, is the mother tribunal of all other tribunals. Why only the ITAT should be a faceless tribunal? I think that's a question that begs an answer, and therefore representations would necessarily have to be moved to government to reconsider this move to make ITAT a faceless institution. While assessment appeals, where there is only one side making submissions, may ultimately be a successful experiment, but ITAT, which has the trappings of a court, where both sides are present, and you have it's actually a list between the two parties. In that situation, may be difficult for the tribunal to render complete justice between the parties. So I would think that this is something that requires a relook, and the government would do well to determine. Of course, they have kept a time period of up to March 2023 to put the contours in place. But I think it's not just to do with technology, it is to do with the very grain and the very structure of the tribunal. That this being the first independent judicial body outside the Ministry of Finance, and where taxpayers look to get substantial justice, I think that should not be subjected to this faceless regime, which will erode the credibility of the institution, which will erode the trust of the tax-paying public in this great institution. Then there is a minor amendment in the VSV law to bar those cases which are pending in writs before the court arising out of orders of the Settlement Commission. Again, I think a small amendment which was not necessary, but anyhow, that's been made. The major change in terms of assessment procedure is now with regard to reopening of assessments under Section 147. The entire process is sought to be overhauled by the proposed amendments by reducing the time limit for reassessment from 6 years to 3 years. I think that's a welcome move. At least there'll be finality and there will be certainty with respect to taxpayers. However, such cases are sought to be excluded, and the time limit is proposed to be extended to 10 years. And it is also proposed that where there is a search, it will be deemed that there is income escaping assessment. So necessarily assessments will have to be made under Section 147, and the existing disputes that arise on reopening of assessment, no reason to believe, no satisfaction, all that are now things of the past. In this new dispensation under 147, the assessing officer will have to, on the basis of material that is available with him, pass an order seeking to issue notice under 148. The assessee is entitled to object to the proposal to issue a notice under 148, and the assessing officer will then have to deal with the objections of the assessee and thereafter issue the notice under 148. I think all these are welcome steps at that stage, so that the assessee is confronted with the material in the possession of the department. The assessee puts forth his objections, and the objections are dealt hopefully in an objective manner. I think now the question will be that whether again this kind of order that is to be passed by the assessing officer would be subject to the writ jurisdiction of the courts. This only time will tell once this becomes law. Uh, this will also see the end of the assessments under 153A, 153C in cases of search which are to be initiated after 1/4/2021. So therefore, all those controversies regarding whether the scope of 153A is limited to incriminating material discovered during course of search, on the recording of satisfaction and things of that kind will all be relics of the past. All those arguments, all those controversies and all those decisions would no longer be relevant in the new regime, which will kick in from 1/4/2021. So the other change is reducing the time limit for completing assessment from 12 months to 9 months, reducing it by 3 months. Similarly, the time for filing revised return again is reduced to 3 months from the end of the relevant assessment year or the assessment made, whichever is earlier. So these are changes in order to curtail the time period for completion of assessment to impart certainty at the earliest. These are welcome steps. And I think the tax department will have to gear itself to meet these accelerated timelines, which I think will happen in this new faceless assessment regime that is already put in motion. The other minor amendments are with respect to the provisions of MAT, that where there is an advance pricing agreement entered by the taxpayer with respect to past years for which the rollback is allowed, then you need to spread over the income to those respective years, and you can make a request to the assessing officer to recompute your book profit for those years. So that will allow him to reopen and recompute the book profit of the years of rollback. And then now, with dividend becoming taxable in the hands of the shareholder, it is also provided that if the foreign shareholder is subject to tax on dividends at a lower rate than that provided under the Act, then in that situation, it is open to exclude the amount of dividend and the expenditure, if any, claimed with respect to earning of dividend, both from the income side and the expenditure side, while determining your liability to book profit under Section 115 JB. So, friends, the markets have, welcomed the Finance Bill 2021. As Mr. Malhotra pointed out, there are some major macro steps that are taken in the right direction to put the economy back on rail, to ensure that that Make in India becomes a reality. We are able to move towards a $5 trillion economy. We are able to achieve the Atmanirbhar Bharat dream. So that steps are outlined in this budget. We wish and hope that necessary steps will be taken to fulfill all the aspirations and the dreams that have been in this union budget. And hopefully litigation on the tax side will substantially come down and help provide certainty to taxpayers to plan their affairs. So with those few remarks, I would hand it over to Mr. Tulsian. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ajay ji, for a very lucid discourse on the tax proposal in the union budget. I think anybody who wanted to have the complete overview of the budget proposals should listen to you to understand every aspect of it. You have been very clear in your vision and explanation as to what is right and what is not right. When you say what is right, you say it with all conviction and with all honesty. And when you say certain things are wanting or not desirable, I think these are the beautiful words for the authorities to reconsider and think that these things are not right, therefore not the right time to bring in. So you are being acclaimed as the most highly acclaimed legal expert in the Asia Pacific region in the direct and indirect taxes. And it is not without reason that you are called like that. So this beautiful discourse has enriched our association. We are really very grateful to you for having accepted our invitation, having participated in deliberation and discourse. And now I would open the gathering to putting up any question which they have on any issue relating to the proposed amendment in the direct tax law, so as to understand with clarity if they have anything in mind in respect of the direct tax proposals. So first I'll start myself. Ajay ji, the provisions brought in relating to the settlement commission puts a lock on the gate of the settlement commission on 1st February in the bill itself. Now the bill has not become law. No ordinance has been brought. The institution has not stopped functioning because there is no hindrance to their accepting the application, nor adjudicate and deciding the application. So this approach on their part, and then when a person files an application before an institution with the legal safeguards provided to him, if he is all of a sudden deprived of that forum and is asked to contest his case before another forum which do not have those safeguards, how much validity such law will have in the eye of the courts? And another thing, that the right of such citizens, can it be said to be inconsistent with the provision of Article 21 of the Constitution with the right to life? So I'd like to have your opinion on this aspect of the proposed amendment.
I think you've raised very substantial points, Mr. Tulsian, and these are agitating the minds of people. First, the point that you made is whether there can be a drop-dead provision as of 1st February 21 to say that the Commission will not accept any fresh application filed on or after 1st February 2021. As you very rightly put it, this is a bill, this is not law. Second, this is not in the nature of an ordinance. And we were just debating today before the Delhi High Court in a sub judice matter. What is the effect of this a similar amendment made by the Finance Bill 2021? And the point that was made by one of my senior colleagues was that under an act of 1931 passed in the British times, while indirect tax proposals took effect on the midnight of the presentation of the budget, so far as direct tax proposals are concerned, they become law only when the bill receives presidential assent. And that is a good, I think, 50, 60 days away from now. So whether you can say that the Commission has today become stillborn because of this proposal in the Finance Bill 2021, to my mind is open to serious challenge. The second, as you mentioned, that pending cases will move from the Settlement Commission, which is a high-powered body, to an interim board, which will be staffed by income tax commissioners who are actually the opponents before the commission. You are seeking to move from one forum to a completely different forum. Again, that is unheard of. Although one would say that you are given a via media of withdrawing your application, but I don't think that is not a safe solution, or that is not a solution worthy of acceptance by people who have come forward before the commission, availing a one in a lifetime opportunity of settling their past disputes. So again, that I think will afford one of the grounds for a successful constitutional challenge to the validity of the proposed amendment.
One more thing which you have mentioned in your discourse is about the provisions of section 229A, which has defined liable to tax. And you have also explained that the last year insertion in section 6, subsection 1A, which has non-obstinate provision, as per which if a Indian citizen has in India income of 15 lakh and above, such a Indian citizen, if he is staying in a tax exempt territory and earning substantial income there, then he shall be considered resident for the purpose of chargeability to tax in India and will be charged to tax in India. Do you think that it is a punishment being meted out to a person for being an Indian citizen because he is working abroad, earning income in a sovereign territory, and Indian government is not contributing anything except he being migrating there and being staying there in a non-residential capacity to be charged to tax on income which he earns in that territory?
No, I fully endorse what is coming from you, sir. I would also tend to take the view that this amendment is extremely harsh. If you recall, the Supreme Court in Azadi Bachao Andolan had endorsed a view that notwithstanding that there is no tax payable in the country of residence, you cannot say that the person is not liable to tax because that country has decided not to impose tax. So if he's a resident of that country by reason of his residence domicile, and that country does not seek to charge tax because there is no tax system prevalent in that country, it does not automatically follow that he would become liable to tax in India on his worldwide income. In the US, one is aware that a US citizen pays tax on his worldwide income irrespective of where he is stationed. He may be a resident of India, but he pays tax in the US. He gets credit for taxes paid in India with respect to his US tax liability. But I think those countries are highly developed. You have a social security system where the country looks after its citizens. Here in this case, just because you continue to retain your Indian citizenship and you may have been settled abroad for several years, just because you have Indian income, you have roots in India, you still retain your roots, you still possess, let us say, a house property which gives you a rental income of 15 lakhs a year. That cannot be the basis to say that you need to be subjected to tax in India on your worldwide income because you are resident of a sovereign country where there is no tax system in place. So unless it be a case of tax evasion, frankly, I would think that the proposed amendment is very harsh.
Now, coming to the third question, which you have actually very aptly explained, but still I have certain doubts. This faceless thought of having income tax appellate tribunal from 1941 till this date, 70 years, 80 years of its existence. Tribunal has earned a great name throughout the world. Its judgments are highly respected. Its judgment, 96% have been upheld by the High Court and the Supreme Court. Such a credible body came into being because of the hard work and dedicated effort of very wonderful professionals. Nani Palkiwala to Harish Salve to persons like you to Srinivasan, all these top people have nurtured it, have given their blood to make it in a very elite institution. It is called Mother of the Tribunal. Do you think by a faceless system, you will be able to create an institution of this integrity and strength? And what for? It is being punished What for professionals are being punished? Because unless you have a system of litigation in the court, how do you build up personality? Wherefore Ajay Bora will be born in the faceless ITIT. So it is, don't you think that it is a punishment being meted out for no cause? Because no objective has been mentioned for making it faceless. It's a court.
Right.
It's a litigating court where both sides are heard, and court judges take decision. They raise questions. They ask ample number of questions. Paper books are filed. These paper books, each provisions are explained in the court. How do you think it is possible? And what will be the final outcome if they go ahead with it?
Sir, I cannot but agree with you wholeheartedly on what you've said. I would digress a little to say that this is not the institution for breeding of personality, but I think a great institution for dispensing justice. As we all look up to the tribunal as the first independent judicial body outside the Ministry of Finance, which hears both sides and is able to dispense and render substantial justice between the parties. And you've referred to the track record of 80 years plus. The respect that the tribunal commands, the adulation, admiration for the judgments of the tribunal across the world is well known. And frankly, the courts, these up to the Supreme Court, have commented very favorably on the erudite judgments passed by members of the tribunal, which are the basis of development of law and development of income tax jurisprudence. I would think that we would be, uh, cutting corners to make this a faceless tribunal. We will actually be doing disservice to the dispensation of justice, both to the taxpayers and also to the litigating revenue. It's not that only the taxpayer will be hurt in the process. You may have a situation where the revenues argument, the stand that they put up, is not appreciated in the chambers by the judge because he does not have the benefit of oral arguments. So, as we can see, a judge sitting in isolation in his chamber may not appreciate the point of view, the perspective from which you are approaching the problem, basis the written submission that you file, which may not bring out. And there will be also a handicap with somebody who does not have the command over the language to put forth his point of view, which he can do forcefully, verbally in an oral hearing. So I would think that this will put both the litigating sides to great disadvantage. This will be casting a very high burden and a heavier onus on the tribunal to dispense justice, which the tribunal, to my mind, at the moment is not geared. They don't have research assistants, unlike the judges in the courts, where the research assistants do substantial research work for the judges for the judges of the courts, and then the judges are able to apply mind. So here, unless we put up that kind of extensive infrastructure where the judges are, fed with research, they are have somebody analyzing the facts of the case. If you submit a paper book running into 500 pages, it will require meticulous examination of the documents that you seek to rely upon on the side of the tribunal member, who may have no motivation to go through the 500 documents that you placed in the paper book. So this, according to me, is not a substitute for the oral hearing. You may have a virtual mode. That's a different thing than saying a faceless ITAT. We can continue with a virtual hearing. We can continue with a hybrid system where you both have a virtual hearing as also a physical hearing. But I think this will require a substantial relook on the side of the government. This is an ill-advised move, according to me.
Any other member interested of raising any question, asking Honorable Ajay Bora sir? Then we can proceed with the vote of thanks. Manoj, please propose vote of thanks to the Honorable dignitaries.
Thank you, President, sir. It's a privilege and honor for me to propose this vote of thanks on behalf of the Income Tax Bar Association, Calcutta. I would like to firstly thank Shri P.K. Malhotra ji, former Law Secretary, Government of India, having an illustrious career in the government, as well as on the other side for giving a detailed analysis of the overall view of the budget, from which we've gathered the crux, which was that the budget is for the future benefit and not for the present. So thank you, sir, for giving us your valuable time and being with us and educating us. I would like to thank Shri Ajay Vora ji, Senior Advocate, Government of India, one of the leading advocates of India as well as South Asia Pacific, for giving his detailed analysis on the direct tax proposals in the finance bill and giving both the positives as well as the negative side of this direct taxes in the finance bill, especially the faceless part of the IT-80. I hope so much has been discussed on this part. I hope the government and the principles of natural justice are not thwarted. I would also like to thank the chairman of this session, Shri S.K. Tulsianji, the president of the Income Tax Bar Association, for having smoothly conducted this session and for having given us such stalwarts and for educating us in this webinar. I would like to also thank Mr. Himadri Mukhopadhyay, Secretary of the Income Tax Bar Association, Siddharth Ray, the Executive Committee member, office bearers, as well as the other Executive Committee members of the Income Tax Bar Association for organizing this webinar in a successful manner. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the participants, the members of the Income Tax Bar Association, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us and making this a grand success, and I hope it has been a very enlightening experience. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
With that and the permission of the chair, do we end the meeting now? Thank you. Thank you, sir. Good evening to all of you.